to conferences all the time is the main driver for progress in your skill set and also your relationship, and basically any professional can become a better professional by attending conferences.
It's not the standard, okay? It's a movie theater, but the visual is great and the sound is great, and I've seen a lot of room and space, and I think it's organized well.
Seeing all the people here today and they're excited about stuff, and you can see the energy and the desire to learn and do new things.
And I was positively surprised about the depth, the technical depth of the sessions, and how that makes the tester part of the team.
I think developers do benefit from coming to QA conferences, just the same as testers can benefit from going to dev conferences. You've got to have a broad understanding of what's going on.
It's really inclusive. I would say it's super diverse. People are really, really open and friendly, and it's really organized.
Conferences are well worthwhile just for the ideas that they spark in people. When people come back to the office, they're full of ideas and they're all energized up.
I'm Doug Hoffman from Silicon Valley, California. For the last 30 years, I've worked with organizations to improve software quality, often through organization assessments and organization transformations. I'd like to share some of the benefits of my knowledge and experience with you by talking about some of the things I've learned about identifying and making organization changes and making them stick. Hello, I'm Doug Hoffman, and the talk I'll be giving here is about process change is culture change, and how to make the improvements stick. Welcome. I really would prefer to be there in person, but I guess no one gets that opportunity this year. But it's, see, 4:30 in the morning here in California. So if I seem a little sleepy, it's because I am. Anyway, I'm Doug Hoffman, and would like to tell you a little bit about my background. I've been working in software quality, software testing, for several decades, and been working with management consulting for the last 30 years or so, and working with organizations to assess and improve the quality aspects, primarily the software testing organizations, but it often goes much deeper than that. I have a strong technical background. I have a master's in business, as well as degrees in computer science and electrical engineering. But more important than that, I think, is the experience that I've had that really makes me qualified to do the job that I do. The topic for today is process change is culture change. That the theme being, if you're going to change one, you have to change the other. And so if we're going to have process improvement, we need to look to change not just what the process is, but how people perceive it. Yeah, let me take a moment to define what a process is. I see it as a series of activities that we perform to get a particular result. It's often described as a work breakdown structure, or maybe a flow chart or a state machine, but this description says what we want the process to be. The process is comprised of people, activities, work products, and how they interact. And this process exists whenever we're successful in creating something, developing a product, releasing a product. That process exists whether we know about it or not, whether we're aware of it or not. Doesn't need to be documented to be in place. Now, if we can't successfully get product out, then we may not have a process. But if we're successful, there is a process. It may be changing, but it's there. And most often, in my experience, when we have a documented process, the real processes that are going on are somewhat different. Sometimes wildly different, sometimes only a little bit different. And processes evolve. They get changed as people interact, as things come up, or they figure out a better way to do whatever it is we're doing. So the processes evolve, they change, and that's a natural thing. That's something that we have to accept, and I nurture. I want to support it. I want to encourage it because the world changes. Culture is the set of beliefs and social norms that are held with a group. And that is something that simply exists. We have a culture, whether we know it or not. We live in multiple cultures. The work culture is the one that we're primarily looking at here. The processes that we are following, the way in which we follow them, that defines what the culture is. And so even within a company or department, the cultures will be different. How you communicate, what are the rules for going to the water cooler? Who makes the coffee? Do we communicate in meetings, or is it by paper? Do we work only through the management chain, or do we go directly to the person that we want to communicate with? Those are parts of the culture in the organization. And these cultures aren't fixed. They evolve because we add people. People leave the organization. The risks that come up from outside change, and we need to be able to adjust to those. So we live in a world of change. If you think about the social norms that we held 6 months ago, before this pandemic, they're very different from what we have today. The way in which we communicate today, very different. How we interact with one another, very different. The culture is always subject to adjustment, to change. This particular change is more radical than most, but in any case, we're here. So looking at processes, why would we want to go about changing the process? The environment, technology, customer requirements, the product requirements, they change. And so we need to be able to evolve our process. I've been hired by people, well, excuse me, I haven't been hired by anyone, but I have been asked to work for people who tell me that they need to improve but don't change anything. Well, if I don't change anything, you can't improve. That the the world itself has to change, but if we fix at what we have, then there is no improvement possible. So when an organization evolves, there are changing demands and we have changing processes. And there are always exceptions. The process itself will have exceptions, that this particular release needs to go out because there's a customer who, or the last release that we had doesn't work. And so we're going to have to violate some of the rules, some of the process that we have in place in order to be able to respond to this exceptional situation. We've got to be able to reconcile those. If it's a one-off thing, great. Let's make the one exception and we'll continue with the process. If this is likely to be an ongoing difference, then maybe we need to actually formally change that process to take into account this new demand, this new situation. Talk about changes. Most changes are not improvements. They're changes. We can make changes all day, but not necessarily make things better. And in fact, most changes make things worse. So one of my rules is don't change something unless you really need to. Avoid unnecessary changes, things that aren't required. Some changes, some improvements are not worth the cost. That the cost isn't just in dollars and cents, but it could be in ego. It could be someone's feelings might be hurt. It could be that it takes longer to do this now. That the person who's being asked to do the work gets no benefit from it. And people definitely resist that kind of change. And recognize that there are limits on how much change an organization can take all at once. I did some work for the US government a few years ago, and they could use a lot of improvements. I described the changes that I put in place as taking their testing organization from the 1980s and bringing them all the way into, well, around 2000. But this was all done in 2015. That organization couldn't stand any more change at that time. And people resist changes, making changes, unless they can see the value to themselves. I'll get into that a little bit in just a minute. Pardon me. So process involves the culture, and the culture drives the processes. By that I mean the roles in the processes, what we do in the processes overlap with the other people involved in this process. At the least, it's at the interfaces between us. I may be giving you a memo, I may be at an arm's length, but that's what the culture says. That's what the norms of this organization are. Or we may sit down over coffee and spend hours socializing as this information is passed along. That's the culture, that's the norms. But there are cultural norms involved of some sort whenever we interact. And these norms are the basis of how things get done. If the norm is we write memos, terrific, that's how things are going to get done. If the norms are we work through the chain of command, the management chain, that if I want to get something from the release engineer, the release, then I must go to my manager, who will then go to the release manager and then communicate with the release engineer. Whatever the process is, that process and the social norms involved go hand in hand. The way in which we communicate both is the cause and the effect. The culture and the process are in a lot of ways one and the same. So if we're going to change the process, we need to identify the real process. And that's generally different from the formal process, the documented process. In order to make the change, we need to identify who the stakeholders are and what each needs. And by stakeholders, I mean not just the people who are performing the job, but the people who are interested in or involved with that work product. So the management team, it could be the sales organization, it could be the support organization. The people who are impacted by this process are stakeholders. And it's important before beginning to make a change to understand what each of those stakeholders needs. And it's also important to understand what influence those stakeholders have. The 6 W's are who, what, why, where, when, and how. How became a W, I have no idea. But in any case, the 6 W's, who, what, where, when, why, and how. If we define those things, if we can find those things, then we have defined the process. You know, who does it? When do they do it? Where do they do it? The who, what, where, when, why, and how. It's important before you start making changes in a process to understand why they do it the way they do it. There's a history in the organization. It may be a short history because it's a new organization, or it may be a very long history, but there's a reason they do things the way they do it. And if you can find out what those reasons are, at least what the big causes are, then you're a lot closer to understanding how to go about making the appropriate changes, and where I would call the landmines are, where the sensitivities are. What are the things that you can't deal with? You can't use this term, that people have such a bad reaction to it that you simply have to avoid that. And one of the things I do is immerse myself in the culture, at least mentally, become part of it, understand it, live it. Until I understand the culture well enough to believe that I understand it, that I can live it, then I can't make the changes, because I'm going to be asking people to do something that's uncomfortable. And if I can't imagine what that means, then I'm not going to be very effective in getting them to make those changes. We have official owners of the process and the real owners of the process. Usually there's a manager who's been assigned the responsibility to own that process. And they will take that responsibility very seriously. That person or people has to at least accept the new process. They may or may not participate actually in the process, and their real power is just to dictate what the process is supposed to be. This is where the difference comes in between the official documented process and the actual as practiced process. The participants are the real owners because they have to live with this process. If they're told this is the process and you must do it, they're going to not only resent it, but when it doesn't work, they're going to do it their way. They're going to make it, they're going to get the job done however they can get the job done. And the heck with what the process owner says that they're supposed to be doing. And one thing to recognize here is that the participants are the real owners, and they will have to make exceptions or change the process because things change, processes break. We'll get into that again in just a minute. Oops. So if we're going to plan for the process change, how should we approach this? Number one, keep an open mind. You don't know what the solution is. I consider that the people who are performing the process are the ones who really know it. And they're the ones who are going to have to live with whatever changes. And so I know for sure they know the process better than I ever will. And so I need to learn from them. I need to not come in with a preconceived notion of what the process ought to be. My task really as a process change agent is to understand what that process is and why. So when I'm finding out about the process and thinking about how to make improvements, I plan a lot. I learn a lot before I start expressing what I think the new process ought to be. I may in the back of my mind have figured out that making this change or that change will significantly improve things. But I'm not going to express that until I'm pretty sure that I really do understand. So I do extensive investigation before drawing my conclusions. And where I'm making assumptions, I try to eliminate those assumptions by finding out for sure. And there are always landmines and third rails. The landmine being terminology. One organization I worked at, if I used the word process, you could almost see the hackles go up. People, they had a visceral response. They had just a really negative response. Now I could talk about how they do things. I could talk about the way things get done, but I couldn't use the word process. And the third, so that to me is a landmine. I don't want to trigger the landmines. I don't want to set people off unnecessarily. And the third rail is a term from the streetcars, where the electric cars have the two rails that they run on, and the third one is the electrified rail where the power is. And if you touch the third rail, you're dead, basically. And so in business, a third rail is a subject that you can't touch it. That this was invented by, this was created by the VP of engineering, and they hold this so dear that if you try to change it, they're going to fire you. Okay, that's a third rail. I may figure out ways to work around it, but not going to try to change it. At least I won't use that term for that approach. I may reuse the term, may help redefine it a bit, but third rails are the subject areas that you aren't going to go there. That is something that we're going to have to live with. And I try to go to all the stakeholders, at least all the major stakeholders, because if I leave any of them out, if you leave any of them out, you may be shocked to find out that whatever process change you're suggesting is dead, because you surprised someone who you shouldn't have surprised. Maybe the right process, but if you haven't contacted the major stakeholders, you can get into big trouble. So what do we need to know in order to make these changes? Well, read the docs. You may have a documented process, but more importantly, talk to people. The documents most often are for the management. The people who are doing the job may or may not be aware of them. They may or may not have any respect for the documented process. So you need to understand what the documented process is, but we're going to have to look at what the real process is. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about diplomatic interviewing in just a minute, but we basically have to be careful when we ask people questions, when we're learning about the processes, when we are planning for changes in the process, and be very diplomatic about how we do things. If we're not diplomatic, we can trigger sensitivities in people and end up with a situation in which I've been told, described it as being dead right. It's the right thing to do, but it won't possibly be done because of the way it was presented, because of the sensitivities of individuals involved. They just aren't going to go along. To change a process, we need to identify what's working and what's not. Be able to see the difference between the paper and real processes. And the current real process is the starting place, regardless of how it's documented. The new process needs to be an evolution to the current process. There's a reason they're doing the current process. You need to understand what those reasons are, but we're going to need to change not what's on paper, but what's being done if we're going to make it stick. Recognize we can't fix everything, that organizations can only absorb so much change, and there are things that might be improved if we change them, but it's just not worth the grief. It's not worth the cost, mentally or financially, socially. So we aren't going to fix everything. And some things that ought to be fixed aren't going to be fixed now. As I mentioned, working for the US government, I was able to make decades worth of improvements, but I couldn't fix everything. They couldn't handle the amount of change. Bringing them up to the 2015 level, just it wasn't going to happen. Yeah. Okay. And in the process of changing this process, right, we need to get input from all favored stakeholders. There are some stakeholders that are disfavored. We don't want to help them along. They're the people who want to spoil the process. They're people that we want to be sure don't get their hands involved in this. Many stakeholders are neutral. We don't favor them. We don't disfavor them. We just don't worry about them. The favored stakeholders are the managers who may have the belief that they control the process, and the people involved in this process, the people who reap the benefits of the process or take the pain from the process. When we're working on changing the process, we need to evolve the process. I start with a piece of paper and I start drawing, sketching what the process is. This person does this job and then hands it off to this person who does that, and that gets handed off to these other people who do this and the other. And I draw a picture and I keep the focus on that piece of paper, on that sketch. When I'm going through and working on the process, you want to be sure to emphasize the things that are working. Make people feel good about what they're doing right. Make sure that they understand that those things are things to emphasize, to leverage, to work from, to not change. And where should we be looking to make the changes? Areas of conflict, where there are problems, things that aren't working. And if you're going to make improvements, make sure they're meaningful, impactful, effective, that there's logic behind them, that the people involved in performing this process can see that this is a good thing, that this is a better way. And it's important that people see the benefit to themselves. Now, they may be doing extra work on behalf of someone else, but they need to understand, I need to understand what's the benefit for me. Now, the benefit for me may be that this other person is more satisfied and therefore I don't have conflict with them. It may be that the managers are happier with me. It doesn't have to be that my job gets easier. Although if I can manage that, then I get buy-in immediately. The other thing about changing this process is that it needs to be evolutionary, not revolutionary. We need to circle back to the stakeholders to see the change being done. Typically, I will make at least 3 passes. The first one, series of interviews to understand what is the current process. And in learning what the current process is, I will also hear a lot about what isn't working in this process. But the first time through, it's purely data gathering. Second time through, I want to show and ask questions about what if, could we change this how might this be improved? I'll talk a bit more about that process in just a minute. But I circle back, learn more, start to make the paper changes. And then I make at least one more cycle through the stakeholders when I think I have a process that will work, that's going to stick. And when I'm doing that third or last times is confirming that they understand what these changes are and giving them the opportunity to suggest changes or object, so that we have the opportunity to make it a good process, make it right. Identify what needs to be changed, talk to people, focus on the paper, not the people. It's not about who's doing the job, it's about what the job is. And as long as I can keep the focus on that paper, we can be very, very polite, very civil. Silence is our friend. In one instance, was finding out about the test methodology and trying to improve a process of software testing. And I asked the question, do you have a standardized template for a test plan? And the answer immediately was yes. And I sat there and I waited, pretended to jot some notes, and the person continued. We actually have several templates. And I continued pretending to take notes and listening. Well, and we're not sure which one to use. So usually we create a new one. So the first answer was, yes, we have a standard. The final answer was, heck no. We create new ones every time we write a test plan. So silence was how I found out what the real process was. In talking to people, be a diplomat. I don't know that this isn't the person who put this process in place, or that this broken part of the process is their favorite part, that's their contribution. So be a diplomat. Don't disparage, don't say bad things about processes, even if you think they're broken, until you've found out what the stakeholder you're talking with thinks about this change, about this part of the process. And very importantly, let them make the changes. If I think it ought to be done this other way, I'm going to ask questions, I'm going to lead them, I'm going to try to get them to realize that there's a way to do this better. But I'm not going to tell them what that way is. I'm going to lead them to tell me what that way is. It's wonderful to see someone else have a great idea that I gave them. Because if it's their idea, then they own it. They like it. So I ask questions indirectly. So what would you change if you were in charge? Or one of my favorites is, you can't ask someone what's wrong in your department. You're asking them to tell on themselves. You're asking them to open their kimono, to expose themselves. But if you ask them what's wrong in that other department, what's wrong with what could be improved over there, you'll learn a lot. And if you ask over there about this group, you'll learn a lot about this group. What you're going to hear if you ask about this group and what can be improved in this group is either a party line or a very biased viewpoint. Not bad to listen to, but don't take it to heart. I asked, what would happen if? And I'm making suggestions about how things might be. But again, if I'm asking what would happen if, it can still be their idea. And then what really bugs you about the process? What is your sensitivity about? So what are the things that you would like to see improved? Focus on the paper. I just mentioned the other guy approach. Ask not about what is wrong in their part of the process, but what's wrong or what can be improved elsewhere in the process. Making people feel safe in an interview. I'm a big guy. I'm only 6'1", but a couple 100 pounds, and I can be intimidating. And so when I sit down to interview someone, I make sure they have a chair as high or higher than the one I'm sitting in. I try to get them to sit on the same side of the table, or at least at 90 degrees, because if you're shoulder to shoulder facing the same way, you can't have a fight. If we're sitting across the table from one another, we certainly can. And if we're at 90 degrees, then it's in between. You may be able to have a disagreement, but it isn't going to get really heated. So make people feel safe. I invite people to look at me, look at my notes as I take them. I assure people that these notes are for me and not for anybody else. And when management pressures me to see my raw notes, I tell them no. It's a mess, right? You don't want to see this raw stuff because it doesn't mean what you think it means. But make sure that the people who are telling you things feel safe to share. And then, as I've said a few times before, guide them to suggest the changes. But make sure you're not the one making the changes. You're not the one telling them what the changes ought to be. And then planting the seeds of change. Where I can't change things, where the organization has just been stretched as far as it might go in making changes, plant the seeds of change. Plant some ideas about what the next step might be, and let them, let the seeds grow or not. What should be changed? You want real improvements. And don't look at the small things or the things that have very little benefit, too high a cost. Changing the culture. It happens from within. The participants in the process are the ones who need to shift. They're the ones who need to change both the way they do things and what they do. And so to change the process, the what they do, we need to change the way they perceive what they do. People need to decide to change. And to do that, you need to educate them. Why the changes are important and how the improvements, how these changes benefit them. They have to buy into the changes. They have to own them. If they don't agree with the changes, then they're going to pretend to follow them. And at some point, the process is going to break. All processes go through that. It may be an exception, or it may be that the process needs to change. But in any case, they have to own the changes in order to be able to make them stick. And to own it means they have to believe they have the ability to change it. And in fact, yeah, we do have the ability to change what we do or how we do it ourselves. It may not make management happy, but if we need to get the job done, we need to get the job done. To make it to stick, circle back. Make sure the process is double checked, that people understand what it is, and then let people see their part of the new process. Where possible, use their terminology, use their words, use their diagrams. Let them see part of themselves in at least part of this new process. And make sure it's not your process. If it's Doug's process at the end, then the first time it breaks is the last time they do it. If it's their process, if they own it, when it breaks, they'll make the decision. Is this a one-time exception? Or is this going to be an ongoing thing and we need to change the process? And that I think is key. If they own the process, then the culture will adjust to this new norm. The people will embrace it. They will make whatever changes are necessary to make it work. So trying to draw this all together, it's most effective to evolve the processes and have the stakeholders, the people participating in particular, suggest what the changes are going to be. Allow or make the participants own the process. I won't take responsibility. It's not my process. I've been listening to you. I've been documenting what you tell me. It's not me coming up with this. It's you, the collective. Be diplomatic and learn what's working and not from the people who are participating. They're the experts. They're the ones who really know. Okay. I think it's time for questions. And let me see. What we have here. Okay, no questions asked yet. If you have questions, please go ahead and enter them. And if you don't have any questions, be going into the room, the Ask Me Anything corner from here, and hope to have you join me there to ask questions. This has been a whirlwind tour. So the question is, we try to make small process changes, try them for an iteration or two, and then evaluate and revert if not well received. What are your thoughts on this approach? So that is a great approach. You formalized the change process, which means that people feel ownership. You've also set it up so that they feel able to make the change or not, depending on how it went. So yeah, making small process changes, evolving your process is a very powerful way to do it if it's ongoing. In my consulting, often I have been brought in as an outside change agent and told you have 2 months to do the evaluation, to come up with the recommendations, and so I may be suggesting some radical changes. But if the organization is willing and able to make changing the process a formal part of the process, more power to you. So I'm going to go to the room, the Ask Me Anything corner. And if you have further questions, I will enjoy meeting you there. Thank you very much.